Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly profound premise, the idea that World War II didn't just move some borders around on a map, it completely redesigned our global concepts of power, technology, and justice. We're going to explore how this single devastating conflict essentially acted as a giant reset button for human civilization, laying the absolute foundation for the world that you and I are living in right now. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this, look at this bold thesis from geopolitical forecaster George Friedman. He makes the argument that World War II wasn't just a bunch of separate, isolated skirmishes, but rather a single, rolling global battle that literally defined the fate of humanity. We aren't just talking about a historical event here. We are talking about the ultimate crucible that forged our modern existence. Okay, let's dive into this by making a really important distinction. Because, well, not all wars are created equal. Think of conflicts like the Vietnam War or the Korean War. These are political wars. They're fought for limited ends. They have diffuse goals. And while they're incredibly tragic, a defeat is manageable. It doesn't wipe a nation off the map. But contrast that with systemic wars. These are totally existential. They're driven by massive tectonic shifts in the global system and an inevitable rebalancing of power. You can't avoid them, and losing them means complete disaster for your country. So, to prove how a systemic war totally rewrites our world, here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, what is a systemic war? Number 2, rewriting the global map. 3, the crucible of innovation. 4, redefining justice and society. And finally, number 5, the shadow of systemic war.
All right, let's jump straight into section 1. What is a systemic war? Let's build our theoretical foundation.
So a systemic war is an incredibly rare type of global conflict. It doesn't just spark from your everyday transitory political disagreements. Instead, it happens because of long-term, deep tectonic shifts in global power. Think about it. In the decades leading up to World War II, the United States, Germany, and Japan were all rising as these massive economic dynamos. But the existing world order, which was totally dominated by old European empires, well, it had no place for them. The global balance of power became entirely unsustainable, and it basically forced this catastrophic, violent rebalancing.
And that violent rebalancing completely shattered the old world order. Let's move into section 2, rewriting the global map.
Let's move to and see how this builds chronologically. In 1939, the world was absolutely dominated by centuries-old European empires. But by 1945, those empires were financially and physically decimated. Almost overnight, the entire geopolitical system collapsed. In its place, we got a bipolar world dominated by two brand new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And at the exact same time, because these bankrupt European powers could no longer afford to keep their colonies, it triggered this rapid wave of decolonization and independence sweeping across Africa and Asia. But you know, the victors knew that to prevent a World War III, they couldn't just stop fighting. They had to actively design a completely new economic order. So in 1944, before the war was even officially over, the Allies held the Bretton Woods Conference. They established massive global institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Why? Because they learned the hard way that economic collapse breeds political extremism. By stabilizing international trade, they were quite literally designing a system to prevent another Hitler from ever rising to power.
And to really jumpstart that stability, the United States rolled out the Marshall Plan, committing over $12 billion to rebuild Western Europe. To put that into perspective, that was an unimaginable amount of money at the time. Remember, the U.S. mainland was completely untouched by the physical destruction of the war, and its wartime factories had actually stimulated this massive industrial boom. So America used its roaring post-war economy to bankroll the recovery of its allies, which stopped the spread of communism and totally cemented its role as the undisputed economic leader of the world.
Which brings us to section 3, the crucible of innovation. Because the existential threat of a systemic war doesn't just redraw borders, it exponentially accelerates science. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how wartime survival directly birthed modern convenience. Take the cavity magnetron, for example. This was a little palm-sized device developed to drastically improve radar accuracy so they could track enemy aircraft and submarines. But what does a cavity magnetron actually generate? Microwaves. Yeah, the exact same technology that saved lives during the Battle of Britain is literally what you use to heat up your leftover pizza today. And the leaps in medicine? They were equally staggering. 2.3 million. That is the number of doses of penicillin that were prepared specifically for the Allied troops landing at Normandy. Now, Alexander Fleming actually discovered penicillin way back in 1928, but it just sat there, relatively unused.
It took the horrific, desperate scale of World War II to force scientists to figure out deep tank fermentation. They turned a simple mold into a mass-produced global wonder drug that has saved countless millions of lives since.
I mean, just look at the sheer volume of technological leaps achieved in those few years. It's breathtaking. We saw the creation of the world's first programmable computers, like the Colossus and ENIAC, built strictly to break enemy codes and calculate artillery trajectories. We saw the advent of V-2 guided rockets, jet aircraft, massive advancements in blood transfusions and skin grafts, and of course, the Manhattan Project, which unleashed nuclear energy. A systemic war basically takes decades of innovation and compresses them into just a few desperate years.
But honestly, perhaps the most profound changes weren't technological at all. They were human. Let's look at Section 4, Redefining Justice and Society.
Following the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, the Allies faced an unprecedented question: how do you actually execute justice on a global scale? The answer was the International Military Tribunal. The occupying powers, the US, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, all came together at the Palace of Justice to indict 24 high-ranking Nazi officials. They weren't just lining up enemies and executing them. They were conducting thorough, heavily documented trials to set a permanent legal precedent for the world.
So, the crucial point is this. Nuremberg legally codified crimes against humanity. Before World War II, international law pretty much only governed how countries interacted with other countries. A leader could just hide behind the shield of their state. Well, Nuremberg completely shattered that shield. It established, for the very first time in human history, that individuals, no matter how high-ranking they are, can be held personally accountable under international law for atrocities committed against civilians.
Meanwhile, everyday society was being mobilized in ways no one had ever seen. Nearly 350,000 American women put on a uniform. They served in newly formed branches like the WEX, WAVES, and WASPs. And they weren't just doing clerical work. They were mechanics repairing bombers, they were laboratory technicians, they were pilots test-flying newly repaired military aircraft. General Eisenhower himself stated that the Allied invasion simply could not have succeeded without them. The war forcibly proved that women were absolutely essential to the defense of the free world, and that planted the seeds for the civil rights and equality movements that would bloom in the decades that followed.
Which brings us to our final pillar today, Section 5, the shadow of systemic war. Let's pull all these threads together. And this brilliantly illustrates just how massive the shift was. The pre-war world was defined by fierce nationalism, sprawling imperialism, and absolute European dominance. The systemic shock of World War II wiped that slate entirely clean. The post-war world, our world, was rebuilt with multinational institutions like the UN and the IMF, framed by superpower rivalries and driven by a total obsession with technological supremacy. The war didn't just end, it actually became the very foundation of our modern global architecture.
Which leaves us with a really provocative thought from George Friedman to wrap up this explainer. The institutions, the borders, and the economic systems designed in 1945 have governed us for 80 years now. We live in the shadow of World War II. But as we look around today at shifting geopolitical tensions, rising nationalism, and changing global power dynamics, are we now in a global revolt against the world that we're created? Are we witnessing the slow build-up to the next great rebalancing? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on the horizon.